and welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. I'm Holly Baker, podcast producer for the University of Central Florida's History Department. Today's podcast features an interview with Dr. Justin Iverson. He wrote an article in the fall 2019 issue called Fugitives on the Front, Maroons in the Gulf Coast Borderlands War, 1812 to 1823. Have a listen to our conversation. The first question I want to ask is if you could define Maroon for those who may not know what the word means.
Sure. So Maroon is sort of someone who's a runaway enslaved person, or maybe they've been born free into a Maroon community. And Maroon bands are basically just these groups of runaway enslaved peoples who form their autonomous groups living outside and away from slavery. And so the term Maroon is actually derived from the Spanish word cimarron, which kind of meant like wild or beast. So that's kind of the point. These are runaway slave communities, and then they obviously, if they can survive long enough, have children and prosper and have people that are born free. But if they hadn't been living in that society, they'd be enslaved by wherever they are in the Caribbean, Latin America, or here in the United States.
Could you tell me about the Maroons in Florida? First of all, what was their objective?
Sure. So this is kind of a newer development in American historiography when we talk about Maroons. It's a much more common theme in among scholars who study slavery in the Caribbean or Latin America. But in the last couple decades, more and more historians are picking up on this. This group of runaway slaves that started to live with Seminole Indians, among other Native American groups in the Southeast, but specifically in Florida. And they started to live among them. Some scholars would also sort of show that they were oftentimes enslaved by the Seminoles, but they had a different kind of relationship with them than with white slave owners. And so over time, then, that's kind of what I show in my book manuscript and dissertation, not so much in the article. This is sort of the ethnogenesis of Maroons in Florida. It's this beginning of this new ethnic group of Native Americans and African American slaves are coming together, marrying, having kids, and producing their new community. So their objective in Florida then is to evade re-enslavement or enslavement if they're born free in these communities, and combine that with Seminole Indians is to just avoid white encroachment into Florida, into their lands. And so these objectives are pretty much the same across the board in the Atlantic world. If you look at other Maroon groups in, say, Jamaica or Brazil or in Haiti, it's always to avoid re-enslavement from white slave owners. And so they fight various Maroon wars to prevent that, or sometimes they'll ally with other European imperial rivals to form a stronger coalition and stop slave owners from capturing them and bringing them back into slavery. And so that's the goal in Florida, really from the late 18th century and then the first couple decades of the 19th century, and before the Seminoles are removed from Florida to go out west into Oklahoma and Texas.
Could you tell me a little bit more about what you call the Maroon Wars in the Gulf Coast Borderlands area?
Yeah, so that's part of why I argue with this article. The participation of a lot of these black fighters, these runaway slaves, these Maroons who are forming with the Seminole Indians, they're involved in a lot of these other conflicts that traditionally we would call, Indian wars or other imperial conflicts. So that would be like the Creek War from 1813 and 1814, right there in northwest Florida and southern Alabama. The Patriot War, which is a precursor to the War of 1812, and then the First Seminole War in 1816-ish to 1818. And so when you start looking at these conflicts that historians long ago sort of thought of as just being imperial contestations among the British and Americans, or frontier conflicts between Anglo-white settlers and Native Americans, or even the Spanish who are still in Florida up until 1819, I think it starts to look a little different for all these black participants involved. And if you start looking at them as Maroons, and you see how connected all these conflicts are, and from black perspectives, it's all about preventing re-enslavement, it starts to all look like one big conflict. And it doesn't really have a good end date until the end of the First Seminole War and the signing of the treaty at Moultrie Creek in 1823.
I'd like to know a little bit more about how the Maroons allied with the Seminoles and the Creeks to help preserve their autonomy.
Sure. So Maroons conduct a lot of raids, especially across the Georgia-Florida border in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. And a significant purpose of conducting these raids is not only to gather supplies and goods, things that they can use. It could be clothes, weapons, food, especially is important. But also it's to capture people. And what Maroons do throughout the Atlantic world, and that's what the Seminole Maroons do in Florida, is you capture other plantation slaves during these plantation raids so that they can join your community. And sometimes obviously if you're conducting a raid and kidnapping somebody, it's done by force and coercion. There could also be another layer of it in the Atlantic world in which if you were captured on a plantation by Maroons, you would be enslaved to the Maroons until you could capture somebody else to replace you. And I don't have evidence of that happening in Florida, but the general idea is they capture people to join their community, to build that community, so they can later integrate them. When it comes to terms with Seminoles or Creeks in the Southeast, if it's just a pure group of Native Americans without any members of African descent or plantation slaves in the mix, Native Americans just raid plantations to capture slaves as well, that they will also keep enslaved in their Native American communities. And obviously, just to qualify that slavery in Native American groups and slavery among Maroon groups was very different than Black Atlantic chattel slavery that was practiced in the United States and in all European empires in the Atlantic world. But yeah, so the point is to just gather people, collect people on these raids so that they join your community, so they can build your community, become bigger and stronger over time.
Could you tell me a little bit about Prospect Bluff and the Maroon community there? I was intrigued by the story of Prospect Bluff.
Yeah, it's a great story. So white settlers, Anglo settlers, called it Negro Fort because of all the Black people that lived there. We now know more that from the Maroons who lived there, they called it Prospect Bluff, in part because they were prospering there. They're very large growing community, several hundred people that live there. And for the most part, they fled to Prospect Bluff from places like Pensacola or further north in southern Alabama and Georgia, and then other parts of Florida as far as St. Augustine or right along the Suwannee River in north central Florida. And they allied there with British officers, one being Lieutenant Colonel Edward Nichols, who was an abolitionist. And the goal for the British in the Southeast during the War of 1812 was to arm as many enslaved people and Native Americans as they could to sort of combat American forces in the region. And since Lieutenant Colonel Nichols was an abolitionist, he was very avid about getting as many plantation slaves as he could to join him, or Maroons who were already freed, to sort of promote that cause. And so he arrived in Florida in 1814. He started recruiting Native Americans and plantation slaves to join him, and then together they fled to Prospect Bluff or Negro Fort, where they began building the fort towards the end of the War of 1812. As that war ends, the British eventually lose and they have to evacuate, and so Colonel Nichols actually leaves behind several hundred of these Maroon fighters there, and he leaves arms with them, ammunition, gunpowder, supplies. He tells them that he'll come back, but he doesn't have enough ship space to really evacuate them as he leaves. And so the Maroons are just kind of left now at this fort, heavily armed, but knowing that the Spanish don't really like them being there because there are Spanish slaves that are also a part of their group. And the Americans definitely don't want them to be there because they're encouraging more enslaved people to run away, and they're raiding plantations along the border and essentially just also killing white settlers. So eventually their presence there in the region will prompt another U.S. invasion into Florida, and which leads up to this great big battle on July 27th, 1816, in which American forces led by Colonel Duncan Clinch sail up the Apalachicola River where this fort is located, and they begin an artillery barrage, and then one lucky cannon shot just hits this fort's magazine where all the gunpowder and weapons are stored, and it just creates this big explosion that kills most of everybody inside the fort. So about 200 people die, and another 70 are maimed, and that kind of ends the Battle of Prospect Bluff, or Negro Fort. And the survivors who are left have to kind of flee and find safety and refuge elsewhere in Florida with other Maroons who are still alive. And that's kind of sort of the big exclamation point of the First Seminole War, and maybe the very end of the remnants of the War of 1812.
Could you tell me about the Moultrie Creek Treaty? And I have to admit, I wasn't aware that Maroons were involved in that treaty until I read your article. So I was wondering if you could tell me more about the Maroon involvement with the Moultrie Creek Treaty.
Sure. So the peace treaty at Moultrie Creek, which was signed in 1823, sort of ends the First Seminole War. And for the most part, for generations, scholars would just classify that as a treaty to end the First Seminole War. It's a Native American treaty, and in many ways, it is very similar to many other treaties that Anglo settlers signed with Native Americans throughout the history of colonial America and then the United States. What's interesting about this treaty is that there are several Maroons who are involved in it, even though they're not named in the document. We know that there are about 17 Seminole chiefs that can be positively identified that signed the document, several of which presided over these territories that had Maroon villages in them. If whether or not they were exact members of the Black groups living in their chiefdoms, they were there. So those chiefs would be Chief Aponi, Chief Moultrie, and Chief Phillip. And then there's one person who is a signer, a signatory of the treaty, named Vaca Pacasi, or Cow Driver, or Americans called him Mulatto King. And he's actually a biracial Seminole chief. He's part Black, he's part Native American, and he kind of is this leader then of one of these Maroon bands. And so the treaty encourages the Seminoles to return runaway slaves in perpetuity, which is actually very different than a lot of Native American treaties in which Native Americans were forced to return captured Black slaves that they had captured in wars to their white owners. This treaty mandates that Native Americans continue to return Black slaves in perpetuity, to capture them and return them to white owners forever. And that's very similar to a lot of Maroon treaties around the rest of the Atlantic world. And that kind of perpetuity clause is not really seen in almost all other treaties that ended Native American wars in the United States and in the colonial period. And then it also sort of set up a reservation system. So the striking part here is that Vaca Pacasi, who is this Maroon leader, this multiracial Black Seminole, the Seminole Maroon, and he's able to actually return back to his lands in northwestern Florida and survive the war rather than being moved to some distant reservation far west. So it's kind of a success moment for him, at least temporarily. Obviously, we know that the Seminoles will fight again in Florida about a decade after this treaty, and will eventually have to be removed from Florida in the 1840s.
After the treaty and after all of the conflicts, what happened to the Maroons in Florida?
So even though the treaty is signed and the Seminoles are supposed to return, Black Seminoles or Seminole Maroons, these members who are of African descent that are among their community living in Florida, they don't actually do it. So these Seminole Maroons will thrive still in Florida for another couple decades. Most of them moved further south. The treaty at Moultrie Creek was in northern Florida, so a lot of these Maroons have moved further south to communities near Tampa, and even further south after that. And then there's this big conflagration in the 1830s and early 1840s during the Second Seminole War, in which a lot of these Black Seminoles, I call them Seminole Maroons, fight. And then, unfortunately, they lose that war too, and part of the treaty at Payne's Landing that's settled after the Second Seminole War forces the Seminoles to move west and to leave black members of the nation in Florida to be sold back into slavery. And so they don't let a lot of those members stay in Florida to be reenslaved. So that a lot of these black Seminoles, these Seminole Maroons, move to Oklahoma and Texas after the Second Seminole War, where they are still threatened by being reenslaved by white owners in those regions, and even by some Native Americans in the Seminole Nation, as well as the Creek and Cherokee that are already in the Southwest. And so what a couple of these African members will eventually flee all the way to Mexico in the 1840s because Mexico had abolished slavery before. So that's where they find safe refuges, is on the border with Mexico before the American Civil War. And then some of them will eventually serve as scouts or soldiers against other Native American groups after the Civil War. There are some descendants of those members that still live in Mexico and Texas. There's also a group of Maroons who were evacuated during the First Seminole War to Bermuda, or to the Bahamas, I'm sorry. And the descendants of those members still live there as well. And what's important to note is that they named a town there called Nicholstown after Lieutenant Colonel Edward Nichols, because he had given them freedom papers once they evacuated, and it was very important to them to show that they were free, for one, and that they were really supportive, obviously, of his abolitionist stance and promoting black freedom emancipation within the British Empire.
That was Dr. Justin Iverson talking about his article in the fall 2019 issue called Fugitives on the Front, Maroons and the Gulf Coast Borderlands War, 1812 to 1823. Thank you for joining our international audience for this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the journal are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and that you'll consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. Thank you again for listening to the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast.